The biggest mistake of my life wasn't signing the divorce papers, it was bringing them to the hospital before I learned who my wife really was. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as Ethan Walker sat motionless in the parking lot of St. Mary's Medical Center. The dashboard clock glowed 8:47 p.m. in pale blue numbers. In the passenger seat beside him rested a plain manila folder. Inside were 12 pages that had taken 3 years of frustration, misunderstandings, and silent resentment to create. Divorce papers. He stared at them for a long moment before reaching over and grabbing the folder. His grip tightened. The edges bent slightly beneath his fingers. This was supposed to feel like freedom. Instead, it felt strangely heavy. Outside, ambulance lights reflected across wet pavement, painting streaks of red and white across the dark night. Ethan stepped out of the truck and pulled his coat tighter against the cold April rain. The automatic hospital doors slid open with a soft hiss. Warm air rushed over him. The scent of disinfectant and fresh coffee lingered in the brightly lit lobby. Families sat in quiet clusters beneath muted television screens. Nurses moved quickly through the halls. Somewhere in the distance, a machine emitted a steady electronic rhythm. Ethan approached the elevator and pressed the button for the 4th floor. His jaw tightened as the numbers climbed. 4 months earlier, Charlotte had moved into the guest room. 2 months later, they had stopped eating dinner together. 3 weeks ago, she barely answered his calls. Every conversation had become another misunderstanding. Every attempt to fix things somehow made them worse. Tonight was supposed to end it. The elevator doors opened. Ethan walked down the corridor toward room 417. His shoes echoed softly against the polished floor. Through the window at the end of the hallway, he could see rain sliding down the glass like silver threads. Room 417. He stopped outside the door. The name on the placard read Charlotte Walker. His wife. Maybe not for much longer. Ethan took a slow breath and reached for the handle. Before he could touch it, a sudden burst of movement erupted down the corridor. A nurse rushed past him. Then another. The calm atmosphere shattered. "Move, please," someone called. Ethan stepped aside instinctively. A doctor hurried toward room 417 with 2 nurses close behind. His stomach dropped. "What's happening?" Ethan asked. No one answered. The room door swung open. Medical staff disappeared inside. Monitors began sounding faster. Voices overlapped. Professional. Focused. Urgent. Ethan stood frozen in the hallway. The folder slipped slightly in his grasp. One nurse emerged carrying supplies and nearly collided with him. "Sir, you need to wait back." "My wife is in there," Ethan said. The nurse glanced toward the room before looking back at him. Her expression softened for only a second. "We're doing everything we can." Then she was gone. Ethan stared through the partially open doorway. For a brief moment he caught sight of Charlotte lying beneath white hospital blankets. Her face looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Strands of blonde hair rested against the pillow. She looked smaller than he remembered. Fragile. Not stubborn. Not distant. Not angry. Just tired. The folder suddenly felt ridiculous in his hands. Around him, the hospital continued moving. Phones rang. Footsteps echoed. Rain tapped softly against distant windows. But Ethan heard only one thing. The rapid beeping coming from Charlotte's room. And for the first time in months, the divorce papers were no longer the most important thing in his life. The hallway seemed quieter after the rush of doctors disappeared behind Charlotte's door. Ethan lowered himself into a plastic chair across from the room and stared at the manila folder resting on his lap. Water from his coat dripped onto the polished floor. He barely noticed. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Nurses passed by carrying charts and tablets. Visitors came and went. The clock on the wall ticked steadily forward. Yet Ethan remained exactly where he was. The divorce papers sat unopened. For the first time since he hired the attorney, he could not bring himself to look at them. Eventually the door opened. A physician stepped into the hallway and removed his glasses. His expression carried the exhaustion of a long shift but also something reassuring. "Are you Mr. Walker?" he asked. Ethan stood immediately. "Yes." "How is she?" The doctor nodded slowly. "She is stable now. We were able to manage the complication. The next 24 hours are important, but she is resting." Ethan released a breath he did not realize he had been holding. "Can I see her?" Briefly. The room felt strangely peaceful compared to the chaos from earlier. Soft light glowed from a lamp near the window. Machines hummed quietly beside the bed. Charlotte lay motionless beneath a white blanket. Her wedding ring still rested on her finger. Ethan noticed it immediately. A lump formed in his throat. He could not remember the last time he had truly looked at her. Really looked. Not during an argument. Not while rushing out the door for work. Not while assuming he already knew everything about her. Just looked. Her face seemed thinner than before. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes. Signs of exhaustion he had somehow ignored for months. Ethan stepped closer. The folder remained tucked beneath his arm. It felt out of place here. Almost shameful. As he adjusted his position beside the bed, something slipped from the blanket and landed softly on the floor. A plastic hospital wristband. He bent down and picked it up. Charlotte Walker. Patient identification number. Emergency contact, Ethan Walker. His eyes lingered on the final line. Emergency contact. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the distance, despite the divorce papers sitting only inches away, she had still listed him first. Ethan swallowed hard. Then he noticed something else. Thin white scars crossed the inside of her wrist and forearm. Not recent. Old. Faded. Several of them. He frowned. Over 8 years of marriage, he had never seen them before. How was that possible? His gaze moved higher. More faint marks near her elbow. Nothing alarming. Just evidence of experiences he knew nothing about. Questions he had never asked. The room suddenly felt filled with secrets. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. A nurse entered carrying medication. She smiled politely. "You must be her husband." Ethan nodded. "I am." The nurse glanced toward Charlotte. "She talks about you all the time." Ethan blinked. "What?" "Whenever she comes here." The nurse adjusted a monitor setting. "She always asks how to make things easier for you. She worries more about everyone else than herself." Ethan stared at Charlotte in silence. The nurse offered a small smile and left the room. He looked down at the wristband still resting in his hand. Then back at the woman in the bed. Outside, rain continued tapping against the hospital windows. Inside, for the first time in years, Ethan began wondering whether the story he believed about his marriage had ever been the truth at all. Morning arrived behind a curtain of gray clouds. Pale sunlight filtered through the hospital window, casting long reflections across the polished floor. Ethan had not gone home. He sat in the chair beside Charlotte's bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes. An untouched cup of coffee rested on the table nearby, now cold. The manila folder remained where he had left it, tucked beneath the chair and almost forgotten. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. A nurse stepped inside carrying a clipboard. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." Ethan rubbed his tired eyes. "Morning." She offered a professional smile. "Since your wife is still recovering, there are a few authorization forms that require a spouse's signature." Ethan stood and accepted the clipboard. One page led to another. Insurance approvals. Medical releases. Follow-up care arrangements. He signed line after line without hesitation. It struck him as strange. For months he had been preparing to legally separate his life from Charlotte's. Yet now every form placed him at the center of hers. Husband. Emergency contact. Authorized decision maker. The words followed him everywhere. After returning the clipboard, Ethan wandered into the hallway. The hospital was beginning its daily rhythm. Visitors arrived carrying flowers. Doctors reviewed charts. Televisions quietly reported morning headlines. Near the nurse's station, he overheard two staff members talking. "She did it again?" one asked. "Last month," the other replied. "Paid for a family's hotel stay when their son was being treated here." Ethan stopped walking. "Excuse me," he said. Both nurses turned toward him. "Are you talking about Charlotte?" The older nurse smiled immediately. "Your wife?" "Yes. She has been helping families here for years." Ethan frowned. "Years?" "Oh, yes." The nurse seemed surprised he did not know. "Sometimes she covers medication costs. Sometimes meals. Sometimes transportation. She never wants anyone to know." Ethan stared at her. "How long has she been doing that?" "At least 5 years, maybe longer." The answer landed heavily. 5 years. During those same years Ethan had believed Charlotte spent too much time away from home. Too much time volunteering. Too much time helping strangers. The memories returned one after another. Arguments over cancelled dinners. Missed weekends. Long evenings when she arrived home exhausted. He had assumed she was avoiding him. Suddenly those assumptions felt far less certain. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to the room carrying a fresh coffee and a sandwich he barely touched. Charlotte remained asleep. Machines continued their steady rhythm. As he adjusted his chair, a black leather portfolio slipped from beneath the bedside table. It must have belonged to Charlotte. He bent down and picked it up. The cover was worn from use. A small silver clasp held it shut. Ethan hesitated. Then he noticed a card tucked into an outer pocket. He pulled it free. The card was elegant. Thick white stock. Embossed lettering. He read the name once. Then again. Charlotte Bennett. Not Walker. Bennett. Beneath it was a title that made his stomach tighten. Board member. Bennett Foundation. Ethan stared at the card for several seconds. He had never heard Charlotte mention any foundation. Never once. Before he could process the discovery, movement outside the room caught his attention. 2 men in expensive suits approached the nurse's station carrying briefcases. Their expressions were serious. One of them glanced toward room 417 and quietly asked, "Has Miss Bennett regained consciousness yet?" Ethan felt the room suddenly grow very still. Miss Bennett. The same name he had now heard twice. And for the first time, he began to realize that the woman sleeping a few feet away might be living a life he knew absolutely nothing about. The next morning began with an unusual tension hanging over the 4th floor. Ethan noticed it immediately. Nurses who had greeted him casually the day before now seemed more formal. Security personnel appeared near the elevators. Even the front desk staff straightened whenever someone stepped off a private elevator he had never noticed before. By noon, 3 luxury sedans had arrived outside the hospital entrance. Through the window, Ethan watched professionally dressed men and women enter carrying briefcases instead of flowers. None of them looked like worried relatives. They looked like executives preparing for a board meeting. Back inside room 417, Charlotte remained asleep. The steady monitor beside her bed continued its calm rhythm. Ethan sat quietly, unable to stop thinking about the business card. Charlotte Bennett. The name echoed through his thoughts. Bennett. He knew the name. Everyone did. Bennett Holdings was one of the largest privately owned business groups in the country. Real estate. Healthcare. Technology investments. Billions of dollars attached to a name he had somehow never connected to his wife. A soft knock interrupted him. Before he could answer, the door opened. A gray-haired man entered wearing a tailored navy suit. Two younger associates followed behind him. The older man stopped when he noticed Ethan sitting beside the bed. For a moment neither spoke. Then the man offered a polite nod. "You must be Ethan Walker." Ethan slowly stood. "Yes." The man extended his hand. "My name is Harold Whitmore. I serve as legal counsel for Miss Bennett." Ethan stared at the offered hand before shaking it. Legal counsel. Not family attorney. Not personal representative. The words felt strangely official. Harold glanced toward Charlotte with visible concern. "How is she?" "The doctors say she is stable." Relief crossed the older man's face. "Thank God." One of the younger associates quietly placed a thick folder on the table near the window. Ethan could not help noticing a familiar logo embossed in silver on the cover. Bennett Holdings. The same logo he had seen countless times on skyscrapers and business news broadcasts. Suddenly Harold seemed to realize how unusual this situation looked. He adjusted his glasses. "I imagine you have many questions." Ethan gave a short laugh. "That would be an understatement." Harold studied him carefully before speaking. Charlotte was very specific about protecting her privacy. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. Privacy from who? The attorney hesitated. From everyone. Silence filled the room. The monitor continued its steady beeping. Outside the window, clouds drifted slowly across the afternoon sky. Finally Ethan looked toward Charlotte. "How much of my wife's life do I actually know?" Harold followed his gaze. His expression softened. "Less than you probably think." Before Ethan could respond, another woman entered carrying a tablet. She stopped near the door. "Mr. Whitmore, the board members have arrived." Board members? At a hospital. For Charlotte. Harold nodded and gathered his papers. Before leaving, he paused beside Ethan. "There is something you should know." Ethan looked up. The attorney lowered his voice. If Charlotte had wanted wealth, power, or status to define her life, she could have taken control of the entire Bennett empire years ago. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Harold looked at the sleeping woman in the bed. "Because Charlotte Bennett is not simply connected to Bennett Holdings." He paused. "She is the sole heir." Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ethan standing beside the bed as the full weight of those words settled over him for the first time. After Harold Whitmore left the room, Ethan remained standing beside Charlotte's bed as though the floor beneath him had shifted. Sole heir. The words echoed through his mind again and again. He looked at the woman sleeping quietly beneath the blanket and struggled to connect that reality with the life they had shared. Their small suburban house. Her aging sedan. The weekend spent clipping coupons and comparing grocery prices. None of it made sense anymore. Late that afternoon, Harold returned carrying a sealed envelope. "Charlotte instructed me to deliver this under very specific circumstances," he said. Ethan accepted the envelope cautiously. Across the front, written in Charlotte's familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words. "For Ethan, if needed." His pulse quickened. "Can I open it?" Harold nodded. "I believe she would want you to." Ethan carefully unfolded the letter inside. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. The first line immediately caught his attention. "If you are reading this, something happened before I found the courage to tell you the truth." Ethan swallowed hard and continued reading. Charlotte explained that she had spent most of her adult life hiding her connection to the Bennett family. After her parents passed away, she inherited voting control of the company, but she never wanted wealth to define her identity. She wanted to know who truly cared about her without billions standing between them. Then came a sentence that made Ethan stop breathing for a moment. "I fell in love with you because you treated me like an ordinary woman when nobody else did." He lowered the paper briefly. Memories flooded back. Their first apartment. Late-night pizza after work. Long walks through city parks when neither of them had much money. At least that was what he had believed. He forced himself to continue. The next pages revealed things he never imagined. Charlotte had quietly funded scholarships through local schools. She had paid medical bills for families she met during volunteer work. She had anonymously donated to hospitals, shelters, and community programs across the state. Then Ethan reached a paragraph that made his chest tighten painfully. 3 years ago, when your father's construction company was about to fail, I purchased the debt through a charitable trust and prevented the foreclosure. I never told you because I did not want gratitude. I wanted peace for your family. Ethan stared at the sentence in disbelief. His father had spent years believing a mysterious investor saved the business. None of them had ever discovered who. Charlotte had known the entire time. The letter continued. Last year, when your mother needed treatment, I covered the expenses through the hospital foundation. She could receive care without worrying about the cost. Tears blurred Ethan's vision. His mother still thanked God every Sunday for that anonymous donor. Charlotte had listened quietly every time the family discussed it. She had never taken credit. Never hinted at the truth. Ethan slowly lowered the letter and looked toward the bed. The woman he thought he understood suddenly seemed like a stranger in the most humbling way possible. Not because she was wealthy. Not because she was powerful. But because she had spent years carrying burdens, helping people, and protecting others without asking for recognition. As the evening sun faded beyond the hospital window, Ethan folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Then he looked at Charlotte once more and whispered the question that now haunted him more than anything else. How many times did I misjudge the best person I have ever known? The following morning arrived with a rare brightness. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window for the first time since Ethan had arrived, painting soft gold across the floor. Charlotte remained asleep, but her condition had improved enough that the doctors sounded cautiously optimistic. Ethan had spent most of the night reading and rereading the letter. Every page seemed to reveal a version of his wife he had never truly known. Around 10 o'clock, a nurse entered to check Charlotte's vitals. As she adjusted a monitor, a faint movement caught Ethan's attention. At first he thought he imagined it. Then Charlotte's fingers shifted slightly against the blanket. He stood so quickly that the chair scraped softly across the floor. "Charlotte," he whispered. Her eyelids fluttered. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. For several long seconds nothing happened. Then slowly, painfully, her eyes opened. Ethan felt his chest tighten. The room seemed to hold its breath. Charlotte blinked against the light, trying to focus. Confusion crossed her face before recognition followed. Her gaze settled on Ethan. Neither spoke. 8 years of memories, mistakes, disappointments, and love seemed to stand silently between them. Finally Charlotte's voice emerged, weak but clear. "You stayed." Ethan swallowed. "Of course I stayed." A faint sadness appeared in her eyes. "You were not supposed to." The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Ethan stepped closer to the bed. "Charlotte." She looked away toward the window. "The papers." His stomach dropped instantly. The manila folder. For a moment he had forgotten it existed. "I know," he said quietly. "I brought them." Charlotte gave a small nod as if confirming something she had expected all along. "Did you sign them?" Ethan stared at her. The question sounded rehearsed, like she had been preparing herself for the answer long before arriving at the hospital. He noticed how tired she looked. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone who had spent years carrying a secret that finally became too heavy. "No," Ethan answered. "I did not." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. "I was going to tell you everything that day." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" She opened her eyes again. "The day you brought those papers home." I had a meeting scheduled with Harold that afternoon. I was finally going to explain who I was. Who my family is. Everything. Ethan felt as though the air had left the room. You were? Charlotte nodded weakly. I was tired of hiding. Silence followed. Outside the window, sunlight reflected off nearby buildings. Somewhere down the hallway a volunteer pushed a cart filled with flowers. Life continued moving. Yet inside room 417, time seemed frozen. Ethan slowly reached into his coat pocket and removed the envelope containing her letter. He placed it gently on the bedside table. Charlotte immediately recognized it. Her expression changed. You read it? Yes. Then you know. Ethan nodded. I know some of it. He pulled his chair closer and sat beside her bed. For the first time in years, neither of them seemed interested in arguing. The distance that had once felt impossible suddenly seemed fragile. Charlotte studied him quietly. Then she asked the question she feared most. Do you hate me for keeping it from you? Ethan looked at the woman he thought he knew and realized the answer was the exact opposite of what it had been a week ago. Charlotte's question lingered in the quiet room. Do you hate me for keeping it from you? Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before slowly shaking his head. No. His voice was barely above a whisper. I do not hate you. Charlotte searched his face as though trying to determine whether she could believe him. Years of distance had made trust feel fragile. Ethan leaned forward in his chair. I think I am angry at myself. A faint crease appeared between her brows. Why? He released a slow breath. Because I spent so much time assuming things instead of asking questions. The monitor beside her bed continued its steady rhythm. I thought you were pulling away from me, he said. I thought you stopped caring. I thought every late night, every cancelled plan, every secret phone call meant you were choosing something else over us. Charlotte stared at the blanket resting across her lap. And I thought if I told you the truth, everything would change. Ethan felt his chest tighten again. Maybe it would have. She gave a sad smile. That was exactly what scared me. Sunlight drifted across the room as the afternoon passed. For the first time in months, neither of them raised their voices. Neither tried to win an argument. Instead they spoke honestly. Charlotte told him about growing up surrounded by lawyers, executives, and people who measured relationships through status and influence. She explained how, after inheriting control of the family empire, she became terrified that nobody would ever see her as simply Charlotte. Then I met you, she said softly. You did not care about any of that. Ethan remembered their first date at a small diner downtown. He remembered how easily she laughed. How comfortable everything felt. You should have trusted me. Charlotte nodded slowly. I know. Tears filled her eyes. And you should have trusted me too. The words struck with quiet truth. Ethan could not argue. They sat in silence for several seconds. Then a gentle knock came from the door. Harold Whitmore entered carrying a tablet and several folders. His expression immediately brightened when he saw Charlotte awake. Miss Bennet. Charlotte smiled faintly. Hello, Harold. Relief washed across the attorney's face. You have no idea how many people have been waiting to hear your voice. Harold stepped closer and lowered his tone. There is something we need to discuss. Charlotte's smile faded. She already knew that expression. Richard? Harold nodded. Ethan looked between them. Who is Richard? Charlotte sighed quietly. My uncle. Harold placed the tablet on the bedside table. Since your hospitalization became public, he has called an emergency meeting of the board. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. That was fast. He is arguing that your condition may prevent you from fulfilling your responsibilities. Ethan immediately understood what that meant. Someone was trying to take control. Harold folded his hands. The meeting is scheduled for Friday morning. Charlotte looked toward the window. Her body was still weak. She could barely sit up without assistance. Yet concern filled her face. Not for herself. For the company. For the people who depended on it. Ethan watched her carefully. Then something inside him shifted. Days earlier he had arrived carrying divorce papers. Now he found himself wanting to protect her from a battle he did not yet understand. Harold glanced between them. There is a lot at stake. Charlotte remained silent. Ethan looked at the attorney and asked the question neither of them wanted to answer. What happens if Richard wins? Harold's expression grew serious. If Richard succeeds, he will gain temporary control over voting authority and executive decisions until the board determines that Charlotte is capable of resuming her duties. Ethan frowned. Temporary? Harold gave a humorless smile. In corporate law, temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent if the wrong people gain enough influence. Charlotte leaned back against her pillow, clearly frustrated. He has been waiting for an opportunity like this for years. Ethan looked at her. Why? Charlotte stared toward the window. Because my uncle believes the company belongs to him. He never accepted my father's decision to leave control to me. Harold opened one of the folders and removed several documents. Richard has already contacted multiple board members. He is claiming that Charlotte concealed critical health information and can no longer fulfill her responsibilities. Ethan's jaw tightened. That is not true. Truth and influence are not always the same thing, Harold replied quietly. The room fell silent. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. The strain of the conversation was obvious. Even sitting upright required effort. Yet beneath the exhaustion, Ethan could see determination beginning to return. This was not simply a family dispute. This was her life's work. Everything she had protected while living in the shadows. A soft vibration interrupted the moment. Harold glanced at his phone and immediately frowned. Richard is here. Charlotte's eyes opened. At the hospital? Harold nodded. He requested a private meeting. Ethan felt tension settle across the room. You are not actually considering that, are you? Before Charlotte could answer, a confident voice sounded from the doorway. Considering what? The door opened. A tall man in his early 60s stepped inside wearing an expensive charcoal suit. Silver hair framed a polished smile that never reached his eyes. Richard Bennett. Behind him stood two assistants carrying tablets and legal folders. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Richard's gaze landed on Charlotte. There you are. His smile widened. The entire company has been worried sick. Charlotte's expression remained neutral. That is kind of you to say. Richard approached the bed. Family takes care of family. Ethan noticed Harold's jaw tighten slightly. Apparently nobody else in the room believed the performance. Richard turned toward Ethan. You must be the husband. The pause before the final word felt deliberate. I have heard quite a lot about you. Ethan stood but did not offer his hand. Likewise. Richard chuckled softly. Good. Then we can skip the introductions. He placed a folder on the bedside table and looked directly at Charlotte. I know this is difficult timing, but there are urgent matters requiring your attention. Charlotte glanced at the folder without touching it. What kind of matters? Richard folded his hands. The future of Bennett Holdings. His voice remained smooth and measured. I prepared a temporary delegation agreement. Sign it, focus on your recovery, and allow me to handle the company until you are healthy again. Ethan immediately understood what was happening. This was not concern. This was an opportunity. Charlotte looked from the folder to her uncle's face. Then she asked a question that caused Richard's smile to falter for the first time. If you were only trying to help me, Uncle Richard, why did you schedule a board vote before I even woke up? For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Richard Bennett's polished smile remained in place, but the confidence behind it seemed less certain. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket and gave a small shrug. The board has responsibilities, Charlotte. Investors expect stability. Charlotte held his gaze. And you thought the best way to provide stability was to question my leadership while I was unconscious in a hospital bed? Richard's expression hardened slightly. I thought the company needed someone capable of making immediate decisions. Ethan watched the exchange carefully. For the first time, he was seeing the world Charlotte had spent years hiding from him. Every sentence carried layers beneath the surface. Every polite smile concealed a negotiation. Harold Whitmore stepped forward. The timing of the vote raised concerns among several board members. Richard turned toward him. Several? Harold nodded. More than you expected. Something flickered across Richard's face before disappearing again. Charlotte leaned back against her pillow. Although she still looked tired, her voice had grown steadier. How many directors support this? Richard hesitated. It was a small pause, but Ethan noticed it. Enough. Charlotte almost smiled. That is not a number. The room grew quiet again. Richard picked up the folder from the bedside table and opened it. You have been absent from operations for weeks. Medical reports remain incomplete. Shareholders are asking questions. I am offering a practical solution. Ethan finally spoke. Then why does this agreement transfer authority for 18 months? Richard slowly turned toward him. Excuse me? Ethan tapped the document. He had glanced through the pages while Richard and Charlotte were speaking. If this is temporary, why does it last a year and a half? Harold immediately reached for the folder. Richard's jaw tightened. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. Ethan continued. And why does it give you power to appoint replacement directors during that period? The silence that followed felt different. Heavier. Richard closed the folder sharply. You are not a corporate attorney, Mr. Walker. No, Ethan replied calmly. I am not. But I can read. Charlotte looked at Ethan for several seconds. There was surprise in her eyes, but also something else. Appreciation. Richard noticed it too. This is exactly why personal relationships complicate business decisions, he said coldly. Emotions cloud judgment. Ethan stepped closer to Charlotte's bed. Funny. From where I am standing, emotions are not the problem. Richard stared at him. Ethan held his ground. A week ago he would have walked away from this fight. A week ago he had believed he was ending his marriage. Now he saw someone trying to take advantage of the woman who had quietly spent years protecting everyone around her. Richard gathered his papers and slipped them back into his briefcase. You should focus on your recovery, Charlotte. His voice remained polite, but the warmth had vanished. Friday is coming whether you are ready or not. He turned toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. And if you cannot attend that meeting, the board will make its decision without you. The door closed behind him. The room seemed calmer immediately. Yet the warning remained hanging in the air. Charlotte stared at the window, lost in thought. Ethan looked at Harold. Tell me exactly what we need to do before Friday. Harold studied him carefully. Then a faint smile appeared. That sounds like someone ready for a fight. Friday morning arrived faster than anyone wanted. The sky above downtown Chicago was clear and bright, but inside Bennett Holdings headquarters, tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. From the 28th floor boardroom, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Around the polished conference table sat directors, attorneys, financial advisors, and senior executives. Quiet conversations filled the room as people reviewed documents and exchanged uncertain glances. At precisely 9 o'clock, Richard Bennett entered carrying a leather portfolio. Confidence radiated from every step. He greeted board members by name, shook hands, and took his seat at the head of the table as though the outcome had already been decided. Shall we begin? He asked smoothly. Across the room, several directors exchanged looks but said nothing. Harold Whitmore sat near the opposite end of the table, reviewing notes. His expression remained calm, though Ethan knew how much was riding on the next hour. 2 days earlier, Charlotte had insisted on attending despite her doctor's concerns. Yesterday she managed a short walk through the hospital corridor. This morning she had been discharged under strict supervision. It was not ideal, but she refused to surrender her future from a hospital bed. Richard rose from his chair. As everyone knows, recent events have raised serious concerns regarding leadership continuity. Bennett Holdings requires stability, decisiveness, and confidence. Several directors nodded politely. Richard continued. My proposal ensures uninterrupted operations while Miss Bennett focuses on her recovery. He pressed a button on the conference screen. Charts appeared. Financial projections. Corporate governance recommendations. Carefully prepared arguments. Everything looked professional. Reasonable. Responsible. Then the boardroom doors opened. Silence swept across the room. Charlotte Bennett walked inside. She moved slowly, accompanied by Ethan and Harold, but her posture remained straight. Every conversation stopped instantly. Richard's expression froze. Charlotte took her seat without speaking. The room remained silent for several seconds. Finally she looked toward the board members. Thank you all for coming. Her voice was calm but firm. I apologize for the circumstances. Richard recovered quickly. Charlotte, nobody expected you to travel. That is unfortunate, she replied. Because I expected to be here. A few directors smiled discreetly. Richard's confidence began to crack. He immediately shifted strategy. Then perhaps you can explain why critical information regarding your condition was withheld from the board. The screen changed. New documents appeared. Medical summaries. Internal memoranda. Statements questioning her ability to lead. Murmurs spread across the room. Ethan felt tension rise. This was exactly what Richard wanted. Doubt. Uncertainty. Charlotte studied the documents without reacting. Then Harold stood. Before anyone draws conclusions, there is additional information the board deserves to see. Richard's eyes narrowed. Harold connected a flash drive to the presentation system. New files appeared on the screen. Email records. Meeting transcripts. Internal communications. Ethan watched Richard's expression change for the first time. Confident. Concerned. Then uneasy. One email enlarged across the screen. It showed Richard privately discussing plans to secure voting control weeks before Charlotte's hospitalization. Another revealed efforts to pressure directors into supporting the emergency transfer of authority. The room grew completely silent. Richard slowly stood. This is being taken out of context. But even as he spoke, more documents appeared. And for the first time since entering the room, Richard Bennett looked like a man realizing the board had just seen something he never intended anyone to discover. The boardroom remained silent as the final email disappeared from the screen. No one seemed eager to speak first. Directors who had arrived expecting a routine leadership vote now sat staring at evidence that told a very different story. Richard Bennett slowly adjusted his tie. These communications prove nothing, he said. Every executive plans for contingencies. That is called responsible governance. But the confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. One of the senior directors leaned forward. Planning for contingencies is one thing. Coordinating a transfer of authority before informing the board is something else. Another director nodded. Particularly when the proposed beneficiary is yourself. Murmurs spread around the table. Richard looked toward several board members he had expected to support him. None met his eyes. Charlotte remained calm. She had not interrupted. She had not argued. Instead, she simply allowed the facts to speak for themselves. Ethan watched her carefully. For years he had believed strength looked loud. Determined. Uncompromising. Now he was discovering another kind of strength entirely. The kind that did not need to dominate a room because truth carried enough weight on its own. Harold Whitmore rose once more. There is one final item the board should review. Another document appeared on the screen. It was a record of charitable initiatives funded through the Bennett Foundation over the past 8 years. Hospitals, scholarships, housing assistance, community programs, disaster relief grants. The list seemed endless. Several directors looked surprised. One adjusted her glasses and studied the numbers again. These contributions exceed previous reports. Harold nodded. Because many of them were made anonymously at Charlotte's request. A new slide appeared. Photographs filled the screen. Families receiving medical assistance. Students attending graduation ceremonies. Community centers opening their doors. Faces filled with gratitude. Faces that never knew who had helped them. Charlotte looked uncomfortable as the images appeared. Recognition was never something she sought. Yet the board deserved to understand what kind of leader they were evaluating. Harold looked around the room. While others were competing for influence, Charlotte Bennett spent years building goodwill that cannot be measured on a balance sheet. Silence followed. Then one director began clapping softly. Another joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause. Charlotte looked genuinely stunned. Ethan felt emotion tighten in his chest. Not because she was wealthy. Not because she controlled a corporate empire. But because after everything he had learned, she was finally being seen for who she truly was. Across the room, Richard remained seated. His expression had become impossible to read. The chairman of the board stood. I believe we have heard enough. He looked directly at Richard. Your proposal is hereby withdrawn. Richard's shoulders stiffened. The chairman continued. Furthermore, an independent review will examine the communications presented today. A collective breath seemed to leave the room. The battle was over. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Relief washed across her face. When she opened them again, her gaze found Ethan standing near the back of the room. For a moment the crowded boardroom disappeared. No lawyers. No directors. No billion-dollar decisions. Just two people looking at each other across a distance they had spent years creating. And for the first time in a very long time, that distance no longer felt impossible to cross. The weeks that followed felt different from anything Ethan and Charlotte had experienced in years. Not because life suddenly became perfect, but because the walls between them were finally gone. Autumn arrived across Chicago, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. Charlotte gradually returned to work, balancing recovery with her responsibilities at Bennett Holdings. Ethan often accompanied her to appointments, meetings, and foundation events. For the first time, he was not standing outside her world. He was part of it. One evening, nearly 2 months after the board meeting, they sat together on the back porch of their home. The same house where countless arguments had unfolded. The same house where silence had once become more common than conversation. Now the air felt lighter. A warm breeze moved through the trees as city lights flickered in the distance. Charlotte wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and watched the sunset. Ethan sat beside her holding a familiar manila folder. She noticed it immediately. Her eyes narrowed. You still have that? Ethan looked down at the folder and nodded. I do. For a moment neither spoke. They both knew exactly what was inside. The divorce papers that had nearly ended everything. The papers Ethan once believed would solve his pain. The papers that now felt like evidence of how little he understood. Slowly he opened the folder and removed the documents. Charlotte looked away briefly. Even now, seeing them brought back difficult memories. Ethan studied the pages for several seconds. Then he smiled softly. You know what the strangest part is? Charlotte looked back at him. What? He held up the papers. I thought these would set me free. Her expression softened. Ethan continued. Instead, they showed me exactly what I was about to lose. The evening remained quiet except for distant traffic and rustling leaves. Ethan reached into his pocket and removed something else. A small velvet box. Charlotte froze. Her eyes widened immediately. Ethan laughed softly. I know. This probably should not surprise you after everything we have been through, but somehow I am still nervous. Charlotte felt tears forming before he even opened the box. Inside rested her wedding ring. The same ring she had stopped wearing during the hardest months of their marriage. Ethan held it carefully in his hand. I cannot change the mistakes I made, he said. And I cannot give back the years we wasted misunderstanding each other. His voice trembled slightly. But if you are willing, I would like another chance to spend the rest of my life getting it right. Tears rolled down Charlotte's cheeks. She nodded before he even finished speaking. Ethan slipped the ring gently onto her finger. It fit exactly as before. Yet somehow everything felt different. Stronger. More honest. Then Charlotte surprised him. She reached for the divorce papers and carefully tore away a small corner from the final page. Ethan stared in confusion. What are you doing? She smiled through her tears. Keeping a reminder. He laughed. Of what? Charlotte looked directly into his eyes. The day we stopped pretending and finally chose each other again. 2 years later, the ballroom overlooking Lake Michigan glowed beneath thousands of warm lights. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the evening skyline as guests gathered around tables decorated with white roses and candlelight. Laughter drifted through the room. Music played softly in the background. Yet the most remarkable thing about the celebration was not the luxury, the view, or the distinguished names on the guest list. It was the simple fact that Ethan and Charlotte were standing there together. Not as strangers separated by secrets. Not as a couple surviving on assumptions. But as two people who had finally learned how to trust each other. Charlotte stood near the center of the room wearing an elegant ivory dress. The same wedding ring Ethan had placed back on her finger sparkled beneath the lights. Across the room, families whose lives had been changed by the Bennett Foundation mingled with company employees, friends, and neighbors. Scholarship recipients spoke with executives. Nurses from St. Mary's Medical Center laughed beside board members from Bennett Holdings. Everyone belonged. That was exactly how Charlotte wanted it. Ethan watched her from a distance for a moment before walking toward her. Even now, after everything they had overcome, he still found himself amazed by her. Not because she was one of the wealthiest women in America. Not because she led a company valued in the billions. But because she remained the same person who quietly helped strangers without expecting recognition. The same woman who had chosen kindness when bitterness would have been easier. Charlotte smiled as Ethan approached. What are you thinking about? She asked. Ethan laughed softly. The hospital. Her smile widened immediately. That is an unusual thing to think about at a wedding. Maybe. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small frame. Charlotte recognized it instantly. Inside, preserved behind glass, was the first page of the divorce papers Ethan never delivered. Beneath it sat a simple engraved plaque. The day we almost lost everything and found what mattered most. Tears filled Charlotte's eyes. She looked at the frame, then at Ethan. You actually kept it. You kept part of it first, he reminded her. Guests began gathering near the stage as the evening program prepared to start. Before joining them, Charlotte slipped her hand into Ethan's. For a moment they stood quietly together. Outside, city lights reflected across the dark water. Inside, warmth and laughter filled the room. Ethan thought back to the rainy night when he walked into a hospital carrying a folder that represented the end of a marriage. He had believed he understood his wife. He had believed he understood love. He had been wrong about both. Sometimes the greatest gift in life arrives disguised as an ordinary moment. Sometimes the person standing beside you carries struggles, sacrifices, and strengths you cannot see. And sometimes healing begins the moment two people stop hiding from the truth. Charlotte gently squeezed his hand. Ethan squeezed back. Together they walked toward their family, their friends, and the future waiting beyond the ballroom doors. This time there were no secrets between them. Only trust, gratitude, and a love strong enough to survive the storm that almost tore it apart.